The first thing I want to say is we have some remarkable panelists, and I know people are eager to get to some food and drink, but if you're at the back, please come and join us. Please come and get as close as you can, because I promise you this is going to be an incredible conversation. Secondly, we're joined with the Finance Minister of the host country, which is hosting this inaugural Economic Development Assembly. And Minister, before I throw it to you, I just want to say, on behalf of Global Citizen, how honored we are to be in your country. And so let's give the entire people of Côte d'Ivoire an incredible round of applause. You've been incredible hosts. Now, with the pleasantries out of the way, now I get to ask the hard questions, Minister, but I'll throw you a softball to begin with. You know, we talk about rethinking debt and accelerating solutions, and you have an incredibly diverse audience in front of you. And it was recently said to me that the problem with debt on the continent of Africa isn't that there's too much of it, it's that it's just too expensive. How do you respond to that sentiment, and how can we all here help accelerate your nation's development?
Okay, thank you. I'm going to speak in French.
Please. That's perfectly fine.
Ok, merci beaucoup. Je voudrais d'abord vous souhaiter la bienvenue en Côte d'Ivoire. Bienvenue chez vous en Côte d'Ivoire. Ce que vous venez d'indiquer appelle chez moi, je dirais, un sentiment mitigé. Mitigé en ce sens que le problème de fond n'est pas un problème d'être classé un pays riche ou un pays pauvre. Le vrai enjeu de cette question de dette, à mon avis, c'est la capacité des pays à pouvoir honorer leurs engagements vis-à-vis des prêteurs et des investisseurs, et cela dans les délais convenus. Il faut être solvable. Quand on est solvable, on est capable effectivement d'avoir plus d'accès à des ressources. On est capable également d'avoir des taux d'intérêt qui peuvent être acceptables. Donc pour moi, véritablement, sur ce premier aspect, il s'agit véritablement d'assurer la crédibilité à travers sa solvabilité. Maintenant, il faut regarder également de l'autre côté. Et pour cela, je vais faire appel à un rapport, le rapport de la CNUSED, qui a été publié au mois de juin 2024. Ce rapport est très clair, il montre que les charges de la dette dans les pays en développement s'élèvent à 850 milliards de dollars en intérêt, ce qui est énorme. Et ça représente 26% de croissance par rapport à ce même niveau en 2021, 26% d'accroissement. Le rapport indique également que les coûts d'emprunt au niveau du continent africain sont assez élevés. Parce que quand vous allez sur les marchés, on se rend compte que certains pays empruntent à environ 0%, d'autres à 2%. L'exemple le plus concret, c'est que quand on fait des émissions eurobonds, les pays africains actuellement qui ont fait des émissions eurobonds, le taux moyen entre 2020 et 2024, c'est 9,8%, taux d'intérêt. Alors que quand vous faites les mêmes comparaisons avec les États-Unis, c'est 2,5%. Et vous allez au niveau de l'Allemagne, c'est 0,8%. Ça veut dire qu'il y a un véritable problème. Ce problème, il est perçu comment? Il est perçu à travers les risques. On considère que les pays en développement, les pays africains, comportent des risques beaucoup plus élevés. Et ça handicape et ça pénalise en fait les pays en matière de taux d'intérêt. Je vous dis simplement que sur une échelle de 1 à 7, la plupart des pays africains sont classés sur le rang 6 ou 7. Ça veut dire que risque assez élevé. Avec des risques aussi élevés, on ne peut pas s'attendre à avoir des taux d'intérêt ou des conditions de financement qui soient correctes. Et certains pays, et ça c'est pas la majorité, quelques-uns, ont pu avoir une baisse de leur, c'est le cas de la Côte d'Ivoire, une baisse de leur risque pays à 5. Et effectivement, avec ce niveau de 5, avec également les notations financières des agences internationales, ça permet à ces pays d'avoir des conditions qui sont un peu meilleures. Mais je dis d'emblée que la question de risque pays a besoin d'être réglée de façon fondamentale parce que les pays ont besoin d'avoir de grands investissements pour pouvoir se développer. Il y a aujourd'hui le besoin de financement en infrastructure seulement. C'est évalué entre 130 et 160 milliards par an en infrastructure. Et ça veut dire que comment on peut financer ce niveau d'infrastructure si on n'a pas les ressources qu'il faut, si on doit emprunter à des coûts extrêmement élevés. Donc je pense que la question fondamentale à régler sur cette question au niveau du continent africain, c'est vraiment regarder la question des risques. Maintenant, qu'est-ce qui peut être fait au niveau du continent africain? Qu'est-ce qu'on peut attendre de l'EDA pour accélérer ce que nous faisons? Je pense que l'empreinte de l'EDA se voit un peu partout. L'EDA, nous saluons ses interventions à travers le monde. EDA a beaucoup intervenu pour pouvoir faire reculer l'extrême pauvreté avec des investissements massifs à des conditions concessionnelles, aussi bien dans le secteur de l'eau, de l'électricité, dans la santé, de l'éducation, de l'énergie, ainsi de suite. Donc, l'empreinte de l'EDA est un peu partout. Je pense que l'EDA doit pouvoir poursuivre, disons, son action en complétant, bien sûr, avec les autres instruments de la Banque mondiale. On a parlé sur un panel précédent des interventions qui sont faites au niveau de la SFI pour dérisquer certains projets. Donc, les interventions de l'EDA avec les autres instruments du groupe de la Banque mondiale peuvent permettre de faire la différence véritablement sur le continent et dans les pays en développement. Voilà ce que je voulais répondre sur cette première question en disant véritablement que ma réponse est mitigée. Voilà, merci.
Well, a strong call for EDA as well in there, which we'll come back to many more times over the next day, including tomorrow morning. But first of all, I want to go to my good friend, Minister Neal, from the very beautiful country of Eswatini. And Minister, you are known for taking a somewhat, let's say, contrarian, and some might say even provocative approach to rethinking debt. And so I guess, what is your message today about how you're rethinking addressing your nation's debt crisis? And also, frankly, like how institutions like the World Bank, IMF, and indeed the private sector, private sector owns more than half of all of Africa's debt. I mean, how can we, all these partners, be better partners to you and your nation?
Thank you so much, Mick. Thank you for the quiz. Thanks for allowing me to be on the panel. Really appreciate it. And thank you to the country for hosting us here. We appreciate it too. So Eswatini, our little story in Eswatini is, we've been on a very, I mean, it's all about growth. For us to be able to get out of our unemployment crises and our poverty crises, it's growth that's really going to get us out of these problems that we are. Otherwise, we're kind of just moving things around but not making real change. Eswatini was on a growth path of about 2% for about 20 years, so really very low growth, unfortunately, just over 2%. And as a country, even though you mentioned to me, but obviously it's a whole country effort. In 2019, we worked very closely with the IMF and the World Bank and came up with a medium-term fiscal framework, MTFF it's called. Yeah. We were on a very unsustainable debt path, so a 7.5% fiscal deficit as a country at that stage. And the MTFF, which was planned for a 3-year period, was to take us from a 7.5 fiscal deficit all the way down to a 2% fiscal deficit. Very, very aggressive. Doing 1% a year is extremely painful. We had a very aggressive path to try and reduce this. What we then did was over 2020, 2021, 2022, we ambitiously tackled this, reduced our expenditure, and doing expenditure cuts in the country, very tough, very difficult to do. But we managed to do what we need to do, managed to get the revenue up like we had planned. Also, not everything worked out exactly the way it was, but when something didn't work out, we came up with something else to make sure we still get the outcome that we needed. So by the time we got to 2023, we managed to hit our below 2% fiscal deficit. Now, and since then, our growth is now 2023, 2024, we're on like a 5% kind of path. But what is interesting about this story, and that is that we expected our growth to plummet during that period. Keeping in mind, this is also the COVID period you're talking about. This is when we all had terrible pain. To our surprise, our growth was above 3%. In fact, 3.2% average over those 3 years. And when we analyzed to say, how come we actually got that growth? The growth was unexpected. We expected to actually have a recession. We kind of expected negative growth rates during that period. We found that it was the private sector that had really stepped up to the plate during that time. And virtually all the bigger companies in our country went through expansion programs in that time. And when we analyzed that, we found that it was actually them realizing government's doing the right thing, government's going onto a sustainable path, and that confidence boosts the private sector, and now we're getting the growth. The growth we're getting now on an average of 5% is absolutely from this private sector drive. And so, we always think about, we need the debt to be able to drive the economy. And our lesson was just to say that, sometimes it's actually the fiscal prudence that also gives you the economic drivers that you need. And it's obviously a whole lot better to take on debt out of your growth, keeping your debt to GDP fine. At the moment, Eswatini, we've got a debt to GDP around 38%. And on our sustainable path where we are, we plan to keep it there. But we plan to take on more debt, and that's why EDA and these discussions are critical for us to make sure it's priced correctly, but at the same time get that balance right. Now, when it comes to your second question, just on the World Bank and IMF, I really do believe that obviously there are some changes one can possibly consider, but our experience, and that is that we always look at them to say, the funding portions, and what can they do from a funding perspective. But really, the biggest support to Eswatini has actually been that support in helping us through the transition from unsustainable path to a sustainable path. And that is very valuable to us as a country. Thank you.
So on one of those institutions, we're thrilled to have one of the head of those institutions here in Africa, Abebe. Do you want to respond to this, what you've just heard from the two respective ministers? And I guess, touch on, I think many of us saw the situation that unfolded in Kenya earlier this year. And I think people are aware that, okay, how do countries get better support to manage their debt situations whilst also maintaining the trust and confidence and frankly, delivering the essential services for their people? Would love to hear your response to that and to Minister Neal's point there.
Thank you, Michael, and thanks for the invitation to be here. I think it's important to unpack a little bit what the causes of the debt pressures that our countries in the region have been facing. Of course, the landscape is very varied and the specific nature varies from country to country, but broadly there are three factors that really have pushed countries and the public finance situation to the very difficult condition it is in right now. I think first and foremost, of course, is our countries face tremendous development spending need, and this needs to be addressed. And over the years, as official development assistance, as aid flows, concessional financing has declined. The only way that they've been able to address this has been by borrowing from markets, which carries high interest rates, as Minister Adama Coulibaly was touching on, and Neal can tell you a lot about that also. So the cost of financing has been very high, particularly relative to how much advanced countries can access markets, but the cost of financing is high. Second, we shouldn't underestimate the role of shocks. This has been a very brutal period of shocks, the pandemic, of course, and then followed by the war in Russia and all of the associated rise in commodity prices, fuel prices, etc., that triggered. And then the tightening cycle that advanced countries went through was also a source of pulling out a lot of capital from countries in the region, weakening exchange rates. That added to the challenge that countries face. So, the way forward, honestly, for our countries is a mixture of three things. First and foremost, you need growth, as Minister Neal was saying. Growth is fundamentally the way in which you can create the jobs that are necessary, expand your economy to be able to generate the revenues or spending resources that countries need to address the pressing development needs. So a lot of reforms are needed, and it depends from country to country, but that's one of the things, for example, the government in Kenya has been working on, but also other governments. Second, also really important that you have concessional financing, particularly at a time like this, when there's a huge funding squeeze facing countries. And I stress the word on concessional financing. What countries need now is ample concessional financing, not market rates. And the more access you have to concessional financing, the more countries are able to spread out the period over which they can do reforms on growth, but also other reforms that are needed, for example, on how quickly do you need to mobilize tax revenues. And I think this is a really very important point. And then last but not least, of course, it's important for countries, for governments, to also show that the spending that they're doing is efficient. It's, and the tax revenues that they're collecting from countries, from citizens rather, is being used appropriately. Yeah? So it's a combination of those things. Michael, the bigger point I want to put on the table is that development is very complex. It's very, very tough. A lot of political decisions have to be taken. And above all, it should be country-owned and country-led, as I think has been demonstrated by the strong performance that we've seen in Eswatini and Côte d'Ivoire and many other countries in the region.
So one of the shocks, you mentioned we're now facing multiple shocks. And of course, one of those big shocks is of course, climate change. And that's why I'm thrilled, Jane, that you're with us. And, Global Citizen is known for supporting in a big way Prime Minister Mia Mottley of Barbados, and her Bridgetown initiative has many interesting ideas out there about reform. But one of the things that they've been pushing is that countries' debt assessment, especially in countries, many in Africa, which are endowed with bountiful forests, natural resources, and biodiversity, that these assessments should actually factor in nature, these countries' natural assets, when they determine a country's levels of debt. And frankly, in debt readiness and debt worthiness, and frankly, to help countries attract more sustainable levels of debt by just putting a price on nature and valuing it as it should be. And so how can you respond to this, about this idea? And are these ideas actually very practical in reality?
Thank you very much, Michael, and it's a pleasure to be on this panel with the honorable ministers and Abebe as well. There remains a significant gap in knowledge between the complex interplay between nature, debt servicing, and debt assessments. But that being said, there's a lot of exciting work going on right now in the continent around nature finance, and how not only financial institutions and private sector can contribute and play a role, but also how governments can finance nature. And we're working with central banks, ministers of finance, treasuries on how that happens. But to address your question, Michael, I'm going to focus on 4 things. And it's about really the strategies for implementation when we're talking about natural resources and resource-rich countries. So the first thing I want to address, and I'm glad the ministers are here, is for African governments, and particularly ministers of finance, to encourage local expertise in natural capital accounting. That expertise is weak, it's lacking, and I think it's important that there needs to be a retraining of economists, of policy specialists within ministries, because this is, of course, interministerial and multi-sectoral, to train them on how to do proper natural accounting, and then that way you're able to have clear, targeted financial strategies that really gives you a leverage for negotiating for cheaper debt. And then the second element is around creating an ecosystem of homegrown debt sustainability analysis. And I think that local ministries should be given the opportunity, of course, with training and capacity building, to develop their own sustainability analysis. And what this allows local ministries to do and ministries to do is to have targeted and effective links to development goals and development needs to debt management strategies, so that you're actually linking the need for debt with actual development goals. And of course, it has implications for how the SDGs are met and any other national development goals and local goals as well, taking into account the subnational level. And then thirdly, I think one that I think we all know is debt for nature swaps. And I know countries like Gabon are famous for that. And this idea of linking debt relief to conservation efforts. And what I like about debt for nature swaps is that it allows you to invest in your nature, invest in protecting your natural assets, because in the long term, you will need them, right, when you're going to look for debt if you're using natural assets as a way to attract cheaper debt. And I think lastly, what is important is regional collaboration when it comes to establishing knowledge transfer, sharing best practices around particular natural capital accounting and debt sustainability analysis. I think that it is important that as a bloc, as a continent, we go together and we share these practices so that we have greater bargaining power when we are having these conversations at the international level with DFIs and MDBs. And, for me, I was just thinking, for example, in Kenya and Tanzania, we have the Masai Mara, we have the Serengeti. When the wildebeests move in August, how do we account for that when it's in Tanzania, and how do we account for that when it's Kenya? So those are some of the gaps, and I think that there's real need for capacity building and technical expertise in order for us to really leverage our natural assets to ensure that we can get cheaper debt and sustainable financing to address development and climate.
So I'm going to ask all of the panelists, because this is a panel about rethinking debt and solutions. And so just to wrap us and bring us to a close, I'm going to ask you in 60 seconds, each of you, rapid fire, just to share one idea or reform that you think is key to accelerating the continent's development. Minister, since we're in your home, you have the first opportunity.
Merci beaucoup. Alors, la réforme, si on doit avoir une seule réforme à indiquer, c'est en lien avec ce que j'ai indiqué tout à l'heure quand je suis intervenu. Il faut que la réforme puisse être de nature à réduire le coût de la dette pour les pays. Parce que, à partir du moment où les ressources domestiques sont insuffisantes, les pays ont besoin pour se développer d'avoir recours à la dette. Mais il faut que cette dette soit contractée dans les meilleures conditions possibles. Donc, s'il y a une réforme véritablement à faire, c'est de mettre en place des dispositifs qui permettent de réduire le coût de la dette. Et là, je pense que la Banque mondiale peut jouer un rôle de lead dans ce domaine-là, faire en sorte qu'une réflexion soit engagée, au-delà de la réflexion, que des actions soient prises pour faire en sorte que la perception du risque sur le continent et sur les pays en développement en général puisse être revue. Parce que l'écart entre la perception de risque sur le continent et ce qui se fait en réalité, l'écart est très grand. Parce que la perception ne reflète pas la réalité du terrain. Voilà une réforme sur laquelle je pense qu'on devrait pouvoir travailler avec la Banque mondiale comme lead là-dessus. Merci.
For me, it's
60 seconds.
60 seconds, okay. Piggybacking on Minister Neal, really focusing on domestic resource mobilization, really strengthening that domestic tax base, reducing illicit financial flows into the country so that we have dependence on debt and we have local revenue to address our development issues. For me, really, really creative thinking on how can we strengthen, widen that tax base to have domestic resources and reduce our dependence on debt.
Minister Neal?
Thank you. My one shot at it would be, I'd challenge the World Bank to consider debt write-off for countries that are developing countries when they have a climate-related risk disaster, climate-related disaster. And that at that point of disaster, consider certain amount of debt write-off to be able to assist them in the recovery from that rather than the other side of the coin. I think it can be more impactful and can have a big influence in the crisis, in the time of crisis.
And that's incidentally very similar to Prime Minister Mia Mottley's debt pause clauses, which the World Bank have implemented for 40 small island nations, which you can check out at Big Campaign online, but it's an important one. And Abebe, last word goes to you. You can either say, dispute any of these ideas, whether they're practical or not, or you can offer your own solution.
No, I think everything that has been said, from revenue mobilization to the debt pause idea, are all exactly among the reforms that are needed. But for my part, I want to make the case for one of the whether it's a climate change challenge or the broader development challenge that our countries face. I think what countries need above all is a lot more concessional financing. We need to reverse the trend decline in concessional financing that countries receive in the region that we've seen over the last 10, 15 years. We need to reverse that. So it's incremental, new concessional money that's going to make a difference for the development challenge. So we need to work on that.
Thank you. Well, let's give our incredible panelists a round of applause. Thank you so much.